My husband of 31 years looked up from his recliner, muted the television, and said the 7 words that ended our marriage. "You'd be lost without me, you know." He said it the way you'd say "pass the salt," casually, like it was simply a fact of the universe, something we both already knew and had agreed upon a long time ago. Our son, my son Curtis, sat across the room on the sectional and didn't say a word. His wife Sandra kept scrolling her phone, and I stood there in the doorway still holding the grocery bags, keys in my hand, wearing a coat I hadn't even taken off yet, and I thought, he actually believes that. If this story speaks to something in your heart, please like and subscribe to Quiet Tears Stories, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had someone in your life make you feel like you couldn't survive without them? I'd also love to know where you're watching from, and what time it is there right now. I read every single one of your comments. People talk about marriages falling apart like there's always one defining moment. A door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows, an affair exposed in a text message, raised voices at Thanksgiving that nobody ever talks about again. But when I look back at my 31 years with my husband Raymond, I don't see a single fracture point. I see water damage. Slow, invisible, relentless. The kind that rots the foundation from underneath before you even notice the smell. I met Raymond Stokes when I was 24 years old and working as a seamstress in a small alterations shop in Raleigh, North Carolina. He came in twice about a suit jacket. The second time, he stayed for 40 minutes after we fixed it. He was funny in the way that felt effortless. He remembered my name from the first visit, remembered that I'd mentioned my mother was in town, asked how her visit went. I told myself those small things meant something about his character. Maybe they did, once. We married the following spring. I wore a dress I altered myself. Raymond told everyone at the reception that his wife was the most talented woman in any room she walked into. And for a while, a good while, I believed he meant it. The first years were genuinely sweet. We had Curtis when I was 27. Raymond's commercial contracting business was growing fast. We moved into a larger house in a quieter neighborhood. I kept doing alterations part-time. Working out of a back room, we set up with my grandmother's old sewing machine and a dress form that had belonged to my mother. I loved that room. I loved the smell of pressed fabric and the sound of thread pulled taut. Then Raymond's schedule expanded, and slowly, the way these things always happen slowly, it became obvious that one of us needed to be fully present at home. Raymond's argument was logical on its surface. He was bringing in significantly more income. The childcare costs alone were eating into what I made. Curtis was still young. It would only be temporary. I gave up the alterations work. I packed away the dress form. That was the first version of myself I let disappear. The second was quieter. Over the following years, I noticed Raymond had started speaking about our finances as though they were his alone. My account, my investments, I'm handling it. He never said it cruelly. He didn't need to. The structure of our days made it clear enough. He earned. I managed the house. He decided. I accommodated. And somewhere in that arrangement, the version of me that once had opinions about money, ambitions, about a little shop of my own, ideas about what I might build, she just stopped showing up. By the time I was in my mid-50s, she'd been gone so long I'd almost stopped remembering her name. What replaced her was efficient, capable, and invisible. I organized Raymond's business dinners and never attended them. I tracked his schedule, remembered his medications, kept the house in the kind of order that only becomes noticeable when it lapses. Curtis grew up watching his father speak and his mother manage. I didn't realize until much later what curriculum that was. The night Raymond said those words to me. "You'd be lost without me, you know." Something shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, more like a gyroscope tilting a fraction of a degree and then finding a completely different center of gravity. I set the groceries down on the counter. I didn't respond to him. I just started putting things away. And somewhere between the refrigerator and the pantry shelf, I made a decision I didn't fully recognize as a decision yet. I started paying attention. When you've spent 3 decades not really looking, paying attention becomes its own kind of revelation. Within 2 weeks, I noticed Raymond had started taking calls in the garage. Not the driveway. The garage, with the door closed. He'd started keeping his laptop angled away from me when I walked through the room. There were new expense notifications on a card I hadn't seen before. When I mentioned it casually, he said it was a business account he'd consolidated. That seemed plausible. I was an expert at finding things plausible. But I kept looking. The actual discovery happened on a Thursday afternoon in November. Raymond had left for a site visit and I was cleaning his desk. Genuinely just cleaning. Nothing suspicious about it. I had cleaned that desk 100 times. When a folder slid out from under a stack of magazines and landed open on the floor. Bank statements. An account I had never seen. Personal, not. The balance showed just over $240,000. I picked up the folder with both hands and sat down on the office floor. We had a joint checking account, a joint savings account. Raymond managed both, but my name was on them. I knew the balances. I checked them regularly. This account existed nowhere in my awareness. The mailing address on the statement was a P.O. box downtown. My hands were very steady. That was the strange part. I thought I might feel panicked, but what I felt was something colder and calmer than panic. I felt like I was finally seeing the shape of a room I'd been living in for years without any lights on. I photographed every page of that statement on my phone. Then I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. I didn't say a word to Raymond that evening. I served dinner, asked about his day, listened to him talk about a permit delay on one of his projects. I was so composed that when I finally went to bed that night and lay in the dark beside him, I almost frightened myself. 31 years, and I had apparently learned how to disappear completely, even from my own face. Over the following 3 weeks, I became methodical in a way I hadn't known I was capable of. I pulled tax returns from a filing cabinet. Raymond always told me was just business stuff. I found retirement accounts I hadn't been told existed. I found references to 2 properties whose sale proceeds I had never seen. I found a name, Weston Financial Consulting, on several wire transfer documents. I searched the name online and found nothing. No legitimate business. I started keeping notes in a small spiral notebook I hid in the lining of my winter coat. Raymond, meanwhile, became unexpectedly attentive. Little gestures. Coffee brought upstairs without being asked. A comment about how well the house looked. I recognized it instinctively as the behavior of someone who senses the temperature changing and can't identify why. He thought my quietness was sadness. He thought he could preempt whatever I was feeling with small kindnesses. Men like Raymond survive on the assumption that women like me are only ever one tender gesture away from returning to baseline. I let him believe that. The night that finally broke something open, Curtis and his wife Sandra Stokes came for dinner. I'd made a standing rib roast, roasted vegetables, a sweet potato casserole from scratch. The table looked beautiful. I'd set it carefully, used the good linens. When Sandra walked into the dining room, she glanced around and said, "Oh, Mom, you went all out," in a tone that managed to be both appreciative and dismissive in the same breath. Dinner started the way dinners do. Curtis talked about a promotion his company was considering. Raymond talked about a large contract he was close to securing. Sandra talked about renovating their kitchen. I refilled water glasses and listened. Then Raymond began telling a story about a competitor of his who had gone bankrupt. Bad decisions, he said. Couldn't manage money to save his life. Should have had someone smarter at the helm. He chuckled and leaned back in his chair. That's the difference between someone who understands how business works and someone who just married into it. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. Curtis laughed a little. Sandra pressed her lips together in a careful smile, and I set down my fork and said, very quietly, "I'm not sure that's really the distinction." The table went still. Raymond looked at me with mild surprise, the way you look at a piece of furniture that has moved on its own. Then he smiled. Indulgent, patient. "Honey, I'm not talking about you." "I know," I said. And then I picked up my fork and continued eating and didn't say anything else. But something had shifted in that moment, and I think Raymond felt it without understanding what it was. After dinner, while I was washing dishes, Sandra came into the kitchen. She leaned against the counter and watched me for a moment before speaking. "Raymond worries about you, you know." I kept washing. "Does he says you've seemed distracted lately?" A pause. "He mentioned that he hopes you're not overthinking things." Overthinking things. I turned that phrase over. "What things?" I asked. Sandra looked briefly uncomfortable. I think he worries about what you'd do if your situation changed. He says you've never really had to manage things on your own." I turned off the faucet and looked at her directly. Has he been saying that to other people? She backtracked immediately. Too quickly. No, just, concern. But I already knew. Raymond had been building a story about me. Not to be cruel in an obvious way. To insulate himself. To construct a version of Tara. Of me. So fragile and dependent that no one would be surprised when I didn't challenge whatever came next. I drove to a family law attorney's office the following Monday morning. Her name was Patricia Owens. She had silver hair cut sharp at the jaw and the kind of stillness that tells you immediately that this is someone who has heard everything and panics over nothing. I handed her the photographs from my phone and the notes from my spiral notebook. She read through them without speaking. Then she set down the papers and looked at me over her reading glasses. How long have you been married? 31 years. And your name isn't on these accounts. No. Do you have access to his retirement documents? Some. Not all. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mrs. Stokes, I want you to understand something clearly before we go any further. She folded her hands on the desk. 31 years of managing a household, raising a child, and supporting a spouse's career constitutes a legal contribution to the marital estate. Being a homemaker does not make you powerless in a divorce. Courts recognize that. I had to look away from her because no one had said anything like that to me in a very long time. Patricia gave me a list of documents to gather and told me not to confront Raymond yet. People who have been hiding assets, she said, often become erratic once they realize they've been found out. Go carefully. Take your time. I drove home slowly. And for the first time in 31 years, I wasn't reacting to Raymond's life. I was preparing for my own. The weeks that followed changed me in ways I still don't fully have language for. I found 2 more accounts. I found documentation suggesting the Weston Financial Consulting transfers were moving money into a shell company Raymond had set up years earlier. His own attorney's name on the paperwork, not mine. Patricia flagged it immediately. She was not optimistic about what it indicated. I went through the motions of our daily life with complete composure. Dinner on the table. Laundry folded. Raymond's calendar managed. And underneath all of it, I was becoming someone I barely recognized. Focused, precise, unafraid in a way that felt new and terrifying and strangely like coming home. One evening, I was going through a box of winter things in the spare closet when I found it at the back of the top shelf, behind a stack of old Christmas cards. A sewing kit I hadn't touched in 20 years. Not the functional one I kept in the bathroom. My kit! The one with the rosewood handle scissors and the mother-of-pearl buttons I'd collected since I was 19. The one I'd brought into this marriage before Raymond ever knew my last name. I sat on the closet floor and opened it. Inside were fabric swatches I'd saved, sketches in my own handwriting of garments I'd intended to make. A wedding trousseau commission I'd been so excited about the year Curtis was born. Business cards from my alterations shop, printed in a warm cream with my name across the top. Eleanor Stokes, Fine Alterations and Custom Design. Eleanor. My own name looked foreign to me. I had spent so long being Raymond's wife, Curtis's mother, the woman who managed the house and remembered everyone else's needs and made everything function invisibly. I had forgotten that I was also, still, Eleanor. The woman who had once made a bride cry happy tears over a gown fit so perfectly it felt like a second skin. The woman whose waiting list had been 3 months long. The woman who used to sketch pattern ideas at 2 a.m. because she loved it that much. I pressed the sketches against my chest and cried in that closet for a long time. Not because it was too late. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't sure that it was. There was a woman named Georgia Whitfield who owned a clothing boutique on the east side of Raleigh. I had met her briefly at a church auxiliary event 5 or 6 years earlier. We hadn't kept in touch. I'd barely kept in touch with anyone by then, I realized. But I remembered her. Warm. Direct. The kind of person who looked at you like she was actually curious about the answer. I drove to her boutique on a Tuesday afternoon while Raymond was at a site meeting. She recognized me immediately, which surprised me. She poured 2 cups of coffee from a little machine behind her counter and didn't ask any clarifying questions when I said I needed to talk to someone I trusted not to know my husband. I told her most of it. Not the legal details, just the shape of things, the years, the gradual disappearance, the sewing kit in the closet, what I used to be able to do. Georgia Whitfield listened the way some people do, not waiting for her turn to speak, actually listening. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My seamstress just moved to Florida." I blinked. "She did alterations for me in the back. I've been taking things to that dry cleaner on Hillsborough Street and the quality is embarrassing." She sipped her coffee. "Are you actually as good as you think you were? Or is that just the memory talking?" I opened my mouth and then closed it again. "I don't know anymore." Georgia stood up. "Well, let's find out." She led me to the back room. There was a rack of garments waiting for alterations, fabric folded on a work table, good light from a north-facing window. She handed me a bias-cut skirt with a complicated hem and a customer note that said it had been taken in wrong twice already. My hands knew what to do before my mind caught up. 20 minutes later, Georgia stood behind me looking at the pinned correction. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, the memory wasn't lying. Something I'd held tightly for decades loosened just slightly in my chest. Georgia offered me a small arrangement right there in her boutique. Alterations work, a few days a week, flexible hours. Not charity. She was clear about that. It was a business need she happened to have and a skill I happened to possess. What I did with that was up to me. I drove home that afternoon feeling like a woman who had just remembered her own name. The divorce papers moved through the system in the way legal things do. Slowly, then suddenly. Once Patricia Owens began formally requesting financial disclosures, Raymond's demeanor shifted from mildly attentive to visibly cold. He stopped bringing coffee upstairs. He started spending most evenings in his office with the door closed. He made one attempt at conversation about it. Standing in the kitchen one morning, he told me I was making a mistake I wouldn't be able to undo. "I know how expensive it is out there," he said, not looking at me. "You haven't had to worry about that." I've been worrying about plenty," I said. "You just weren't watching." He left the room without answering. My first apartment was on the 3rd floor of a renovated building on the north side of the city. It was smaller than my bedroom had been in the house. The afternoon light came through the west windows beautifully, and I stood in the empty living room the first evening after moving in and let the silence happen around me instead of filling it. It was strange, that silence. Not peaceful yet, just real. Mine. The first month was the hardest. I won't smooth that over. Some mornings I woke up already exhausted before I moved, the weight of the uncertainty settling into my chest before I was even fully conscious. I had no income yet. The legal proceedings were ongoing. Patricia had uncovered enough documentation to suggest a significant discrepancy between what Raymond had disclosed and what actually existed in the marital estate. But legal processes take time and time is expensive. I started at George's boutique the second week after the move. I came in 3 mornings a week and worked through stacks of alterations. At first my hands were stiff. My eye was sharp, but my pace was slow, and I'd compensate for the slowness by staying later than I needed to, learning the rhythm of the workroom again. The other thing I started doing, quietly, on my own, was taking notes. Not legal notes, sewing notes, pattern ideas. I'd had an image in my head for years of a structured blazer in a particular cut that I'd never seen done right for women over 50. I started sketching it. Then another. Then a dress with a draped collar I used to do in my alterations days that clients had always loved. I was filling a notebook with designs for garments I had no immediate plan to make. Georgia noticed the notebooks on the work table one morning. She didn't say anything right away. She just looked at them for a long moment, then looked at me, and went back to what she was doing. A week later, she brought it up. "You should be making those. I'm focused on getting through this year first. You can do both." She said it so simply, I almost believed her. The moment that changed the public shape of everything happened on a Saturday in late February. Georgia had been invited to participate in a community market event. Local vendors, artisans, small businesses, a fundraiser for a neighborhood school. She asked me to come along and help manage the boutique's table. I had brought 3 items I'd made myself. A blouse in a deep teal linen, a tailored vest, and a quilted tote with a structured base. I hadn't intended to sell them. I'd made them for myself, for practice, because the only way to get your hands back is to use them. Georgia arranged them at the end of our table without asking me. By noon, 2 of the 3 had sold. A woman in her 60s touched the vest the way you touch something you recognize. She asked me if I had more. I said not yet. She handed me her card and said, "Please contact me when you do." I was standing there, holding that card when I heard Raymond's voice. He was 3 tables down, talking to someone from his neighborhood men's association. He turned and saw me at the same moment I saw him. His face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise. Then assessment. Then, very quickly, something I could only describe as contempt. He walked over. "I didn't know you were doing this," he said, not warmly. "There are a lot of things you didn't know." I kept my voice even. He looked at the table, at the remaining blouse, at the small handwritten sign Georgia had placed, "Eleanor Stokes Design." Eleanor. He said my name the way you repeat a word in a foreign language, testing whether you've understood it correctly. "You're selling clothes at a street fair, community market," Georgia said from 3 feet away where she had absolutely been listening. Raymond ignored her. His voice dropped lower. "This isn't a plan, Eleanor. This is a hobby. You're 62 years old. I know how old I am. You can't build something real from this." He glanced at the items on the table. "This is what happens when people get ideas." He said the word ideas like it was a mild pathology. I looked at him very steadily. I had practiced being afraid of that look for 31 years. And standing there in the February cold with a stranger's business card in my hand, I realized the fear had gone quiet. Not gone completely. I don't want to lie about that. But quiet enough that I could hear myself think underneath it. "You should go back to your friends, Raymond." He started to say something else. Georgia stepped forward and placed a hand on the table between us, with a cheerful smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you find something today, sir?" He left. I stood very still for a moment. Then the woman who had bought the vest came back with a friend who wanted to see the blouse, and I turned to help her, and the afternoon continued. That night, I received a voicemail I almost deleted without listening to. A woman's voice, professional, calm. She introduced herself as Brenda Colby. She ran a small women's professional network in Raleigh. Events, community programs, a yearly showcase for women-owned businesses. She had been at the market. She had bought the teal blouse. I hadn't seen her purchase it. Georgia must have completed the sale while I was dealing with Raymond. She said, "I'd love to talk with you about what you're building." The words landed strangely. What you're building? I had not yet let myself think in those terms. I called her back the next morning. Brenda Colby was 64 years old, a former corporate attorney who had built the network from a supper club of 12 women to an organization with several hundred members. She talked the way people do when they've spent their lives being taken seriously. Directly, without filler, without the habit of softening every sentence to avoid taking up space. We met at a coffee shop on Glenwood Avenue. She arrived with a portfolio of her organization's work and asked me to bring photographs of mine. I showed up with my phone and 3 folded sketches I'd done the night before, certain I was wasting her time. She looked at the sketches for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "Tell me about your training," I told her. The alterations shop, the clients, what I'd put down when Curtis was born, what I'd kept in the back of the closet for 30 years. Brenda set down her coffee. "What do you actually want to build?" The question caught me so off guard that I answered it honestly instead of carefully. A small design studio, custom pieces primarily for women 45 and older who feel like clothing stops being made for them at a certain point. Women who want to look like themselves instead of an approximation of some younger version. I paused. "That probably sounds narrow. It sounds like an underserved market to me," Brenda said. She offered to feature my work at the network's spring showcase. Not charity, visibility. An audience of women exactly in the demographic I had described, many of whom were decision makers, influencers, community connectors. "You bring the work," she said simply. "I'll bring the room." I sat in my car after that meeting for a long time before starting the engine. The legal proceedings moved toward conclusion in the early summer. Patricia had built a case, solid enough that the financial discrepancy was undeniable. The shell company. The hidden accounts. Wire transfers that Patricia's forensic accountant had traced through 3 different financial entities over 8 years. Raymond's attorneys negotiated hard, but the documentation was extensive. There was also the matter of a forged signature on a refinancing document connected to a property sale from 6 years earlier. Patricia had noticed the inconsistency and had a handwriting specialist review it. The result was unambiguous. When she told me, I sat in her office and couldn't speak for nearly a minute. Raymond had not just hidden money, he had falsified my consent. Multiple times, across multiple transactions. On paper, I had authorized things I had never been told about and never agreed to. The room felt very small. I stared at the documents until the numbers blurred. Did he think I would never find out? I finally asked. Patricia looked at me carefully. I think he was counting on you not looking. That sentence was perhaps the most honest thing anyone said to me during that entire year. Because she was right, and I had spent 31 years being exactly the person he'd counted on me to be. Curtis called me that evening. His voice was strained in the way it got when he was trying to manage his feelings from a distance. He'd heard through his father that the legal proceedings were escalating. He used the word escalating like I was the one who had escalated anything. Mom, he said, is this really necessary? All of this? I took a breath. Your father forged my signature, Curtis. Silence. On financial documents. Multiple times. More silence then. Are they sure? A handwriting specialist verified it. I heard him exhale. I knew what he was weighing. He loved his father. He had grown up watching his father take up space and watching me make room. It was the only model of marriage he had ever seen up close. I understood what he was doing, even as it broke something in me. I just don't want the family to fall apart, he said finally. Curtis! My voice was quiet. The family didn't fall apart because I got a lawyer. He didn't answer, but he didn't argue either, and I chose to hold that as a beginning. The spring showcase was held in a renovated warehouse space in downtown Raleigh. Brenda Colby had filled it with women. Professionals, community leaders, educators, retirees, business owners. And the energy in the room was unlike anything I'd experienced in a very long time. Purposeful, warm, like being in a space where everyone had already agreed that you were allowed to take up room. I had made 7 pieces. A structured blazer in charcoal and cream. 2-day dresses with the draped collar I'd been dreaming about for years. A linen skirt cut on a slight diagonal that moved beautifully. And 3 custom pieces I'd made on commission for women from George's boutique who had come back after the market. I stood behind my small display table and felt absolutely terrified. Within the first hour, I had 3 serious conversations with women who wanted to know about commissions. A woman named Denise, I'll call her that, touched the blazer and said, "This is the first time in 2 years I've put on something and felt like myself." She was 67 years old. She had been through her own version of a beginning again story. We talked for 20 minutes. Brenda appeared at my elbow around 7:30. She was smiling in a contained way that I was beginning to recognize as her form of enthusiasm. Do you know what people are saying about you out there? That I'm a nice lady with sewing skills? Brenda laughed. That you make women feel visible. She paused. That's not a small thing, Eleanor. I took a commission order from 4 women that evening. I drove home at 10 o'clock with my trunk full of display materials and pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building and sat for a long moment with my hands on the wheel. The night was quiet. The lot was mostly dark, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 30 years of managing a household and supporting someone else's ambitions and making everything look easy. I felt like I had just finished doing something that was mine. Raymond came to see me once after the settlement was signed. He had lost the house, couldn't maintain the mortgage. Once the financial disclosures led to a renegotiated settlement that reflected what the marital estate actually contained. He had moved to a smaller place outside the city. I heard this from Curtis, who was slowly, carefully, learning how to be in relationship with both of his parents at once. It was hard for him. I gave him room for it to be hard. Raymond arrived at the boutique on a Tuesday. Georgia recognized him immediately from the market and found a reason to stay visible near the back workroom. He looked older. Not dramatically, just in the way that shows up when someone has been carrying something heavy for a while. He sat down across from me at the small table near the window and looked around the workspace, at the mannequins and the cutting table and the rack of finished pieces waiting for pickup. You really built something, he said. Yes. He was quiet. Then, I didn't think you would. I know. Raymond folded his hands. He had something he wanted to say and was working up to it in the way he always had, through the side door instead of directly. I've been thinking a lot about how I handled things. Which things? He looked at me. All of it! I waited. I think I needed you to need me. He said it slowly, like he was testing the sentence as it came out. I don't think I knew that's what I was doing, but looking back. He stopped. Started again. Looking back, I think that's what it was. The honesty of it surprised me, and also didn't. I know, I said again, and this time it wasn't a challenge, just recognition. I was wrong about what you could do, he said. I want you to know I know that. I looked at him across the small table. This man I had loved. This man who had needed me small in order to feel sufficient. There was grief in looking at him still, even then. Not for the marriage exactly, but for the years. For the version of us that existed in the first decade, before the structure of our life calcified round his comfort in my absence. For the woman who had packed away her dress form thinking it was temporary. I believe you, I said. He looked slightly undone by that, like he'd been bracing for an argument and the lack of one left him off balance. We sat for another few minutes. He asked about the business. I told him honestly how it was going. He nodded and seemed genuinely glad, in the sad way of someone who understands they forfeited the right to be fully glad. Before he left, he stood at the door for a moment. Was I really that difficult to live with? I thought about 31 years, the way he said my money and my investments, the way he talked about my work like it was a pastime, the signed documents, the P.O. box, the evenings I spent making his life function while he forgot I was doing it. Curtis laughing at that dinner table. Sandra saying he worries about you. You made it very hard to exist fully, I said. That's the most honest answer I have. He nodded slowly. Then he walked out into the afternoon. Curtis came for dinner at my apartment 2 weeks after that. He brought takeout and ate it sitting on the floor with me because I still only had one real chair and neither of us minded. He'd been doing that kind of thing more lately. Showing up without ceremony, without needing the visit to resolve anything. Just showing up. He looked around the apartment at some point in the evening. He noticed the sketches taped to the wall above my work table, the fabric swatches, the books on pattern drafting I'd ordered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm sorry I didn't protect you better. I looked at my son. You were doing what you knew. I should have known better. Maybe, but you know better now. He was quiet. Then Dad always said you needed him. I know. Curtis looked at me. I think he needed to believe that more than it was true. That was the most perceptive thing I'd heard him say about his father. I told him so. He looked uncomfortable and pleased at the same time, which is a very specific expression that is entirely his. Within 14 months of the divorce being finalized, Eleanor Stokes Design had a small dedicated studio space on the second floor of a building on Person Street in Raleigh. 2 part-time employees. Because distracted them. A waiting list for custom commissions. A partnership with Georgia Whitfield's boutique for a capsule collection of ready-to-wear pieces designed for women over 50. And a recurring feature in a regional women's lifestyle publication that Brenda Colby had connected me to. I'm not telling this story because it ended perfectly. Some days I still move through the apartment in the early morning and feel the strange absence of a life I spent 3 decades building, even a life that was slowly draining me. Healing is not a clean line. It circles back. It requires you to be patient with yourself in ways you maybe never learned. But I'll tell you what Raymond Stokes never believed about me. He never believed I would look. He never believed that underneath 31 years of household management and quiet accommodation, there was still a woman who remembered what she loved, what she was made to do, what she was worth. He was so certain that I had forgotten myself that it never occurred to him to worry about what would happen if I remembered. And on the morning, I opened my studio for the first time. Standing in the empty room, with good north light coming through the window, a sewing machine on the work table, and my name on a small sign beside the door. I understood something I want to leave you with, wherever you're watching from tonight. No one gets to decide the length of your beginning. Not a husband who needed you helpless. Not a son who learned to look away. Not the years you spent shrinking into someone else's shape of you. Some women wait until 62 to remember who they are. And when they finally do, they find out she was never as lost as everyone needed her to be.